Hey guys, Jim here with another video for you. This is 50 Years in Film, 2004. But before we begin, at the end of this video, if you like what you see, please consider giving me a thumbs up, a possible subscribe, but most importantly, leave comments below. I'd love hearing back from you guys and discussing movies with you. Before we begin, we're going to issue the normal caveat. This is not all of the films from 2004. Simply, these are the films that I own in my collection, whether on Blu-ray or DVD. The second caveat is, this is not a ranking video of any way, shape, or form. This is simply a recap of the movies from that year that I happen to own in my collection. And also, for this video, we're going to do what we normally do, but I'm going to make a special second video to go along with this. Because as I said in a previous video, I was working at a movie theater in 2003, 2004. And in addition to having a lot of titles from this year, I have a lot of stories from this year having to do with my experiences working in that theater with some of these films. So I'm going to go through these as quickly as possible. I'm not going to get into too much for plots and such on this video. However, I will be discussing some of these movies in more depth on a future video. So we're going to go ahead and jump right into it like we normally do. But I am starting this video off a little differently. We're starting with The Passion of the Christ, directed by Mel Gibson, starring Jim Caviezel as Jesus Christ. This movie was a huge gamble for Mel Gibson. He funded this himself. This was a passion project for him, and more or less self-released it. None of the major movie companies would touch this when it was released because, in addition to the graphic violence, this movie is told strictly in Latin. He wanted to make this as historical as possible, and the movie companies didn't think that, no pun intended, that this movie would have a chance in hell of being successful. And my God, were they wrong. To date, as far as I know, this is the most successful independent production ever. It made over $363 million in America alone. This is one of the films that we will be discussing in a future video. But I wanted to start it off with this movie, Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ. Now we're going to switch around in genre like we normally do. We're going to start off with animation. And we begin with that year's Pixar film, The Incredibles, featuring the voices of Holly Hunter and Craig T. Nelson, among others. Directed by Brad Bird. The Incredibles is a great movie. It's not only a great animated kids movie, it's a great spoof of superheroes. It's just a great movie. And again, like the previous couple of Pixar movies, at this point, Pixar was batting 1,000, and it continued with this film. Love it. But the most successful animated film that year, and the most successful film domestically that year, was Shrek II. Again, featuring the voices of Mike Myers, Cameron Diaz, and Eddie Murphy. And added to the mix this time, Julie Andrews, John Cleese, and Antonio Banderas as Puss in Boots. Shrek 2 is one of those rare occasions where the sequel is arguably better than the original. Enough said, this movie's awesome. Now we're going to switch over to some comedies. We're going to begin with Shall We Dance, starring Richard Gere, Susan Sarandon, and Jennifer Lopez. I'll be honest with you, never seen this. This is one of my wife's movies. Have no opinion on it, never seen it. Then we have 50 First Dates with Adam Sandler, Drew Barrymore, Sean Astin, and Dan Aykroyd. I love this movie. This is one of my favorite Adam Sandler movies. Directed by Peter Siegel, sorry. I really like this movie. I'm not a romantic comedy guy. This movie's really good. Then we go from one Saturday Night Live veteran to another with Will Ferrell and Anchorman, The Legend of Ron Burgundy. This is my rich mahogany edition, as you can see. Co-starring Christina Applegate, Paul Rudd, David Koechner, and Steve Carell. And the late, great Fred Willard. I want to give Fred Willard a shout out. Anchorman is still my favorite Will Ferrell movie. I absolutely love this movie, and it's mainly because of the supporting cast. Although Will Ferrell is very funny in this movie. But Paul Rudd, David Koechner, and especially Steve Carell absolutely steal this movie. I love Anchorman. Then we've got Jersey Girl, written and directed by Kevin Smith, starring Ben Affleck, Liv Tyler, Jennifer Lopez, and the late, great George Carlin. This was Kevin Smith's attempt to make his movies a little more adult and a little more mainstream, and thought that this would have the best shot of doing so, and it is. It's a heartwarming story, but this movie was a huge flop. And a lot of it had to do with the fact that this was about the time that Ben Affleck and Jennifer Lopez were together the first time around, and they had a movie called Yeagly or whatever the hell it's called. I've never seen it. Came out, huge flop, and a lot of that carried over to this film. This is not one of Kevin Smith's best films, don't get me wrong. It's not his worst, though. And George Carlin is great in this movie. I like Jersey Girl. I don't love it, but I do like it. And then we've got two of the most unexpected comedies ever from this year. First, Harold and Kumar Go to White Castle, starring John Cho, Cal Penn, and Neil Patrick Harris. Directed by Danny Letter, the guy who directed Dude, Where's My Car? This is one of the movies we're going to talk about on that future video. But as it is, I absolutely love this movie. It is absolutely hysterically funny. And even though it is incredibly stupid, it has something to say. We'll get into it later. Then we have Team America, World Police. Directed by Trey Parker. Written by Matt Stone and Trey Parker. And featuring the voices of Matt Stone, Trey Parker, and Matt Damon. Not really. I love this movie. I did not see this one theatrically because by the time this movie came out, I was no longer working at that theater. I didn't see it theatrically because I thought it was, even for the South Park guys, going to be a total waste of money, and how stupid could a movie with puppets be? And yes, this movie is stupid. It's also incredibly funny. I love this movie. And it's taking everything I have not to sing the America song, but I don't want to get booted off of YouTube, so we'll just leave it at that. Team America, F yeah. Now we're starting to go into the dramas slowly, but this is also a comedy. It's a comedy drama. Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, starring Jim Carrey, Kate Winslet, Kirsten Dunst, Elijah Wood, Mark Ruffalo, Tom Wilkinson. This movie's got a great cast. Written by Charlie Kaufman and directed by Michael Gondry. Again, I said earlier, I'm not a romantic comedy type guy. I'm not a romance movie type guy. Doesn't mean I'm not romantic. It's just I'm not into those types of movies. This is a wonderful, quirky, weird, excellent movie. Can't recommend it enough. Now we're going into the dramas. We're starting off with The Manchurian Candidate, directed by Jonathan Demme, starring Denzel Washington, Liev Schreiber, and Meryl Streep. This is a remake, of course, of the 60s classic directed by John Frankenheimer, starring Frank Sinatra. And this movie is not as good as that movie. However, it is very good. I watched this again recently. I forgot I even owned this. And when I was going through the movies, I found this and threw it on. And yeah, it still holds up. Meryl Streep is great in this movie. She's just as scary as Angela Lansbury was in the original. If you've never seen either version, my advice would be, hey, go ahead and start with this movie. And if you like it, check out the original, which to me is a better movie, but this one's definitely more accessible. And then we've got Collateral, directed by Michael Mann, starring Tom Cruise, Jamie Foxx, Javier Bardem, and Jada Pinkett Smith. I love this movie. This is one of Michael Mann's most underrated movies. It was a hit when it came out. It wasn't a huge hit, but it was a hit. And the reviews were good. But again, this is one of those Michael Mann movies that just kind of got put underneath the radar. And this has got one of Tom Cruise's best performances in it. Both of these guys, very solid. They work together extremely well. They play off each other extremely well. Tom Cruise ought to play more villains because he's great in this movie. Okay, now we're switching over to the action, kinda. We're going to start off with, from my Harry Potter collection, Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, directed by Alfonso Cuarón, starring all the cast, but also bringing in Gary Oldman and David Thewlis, I believe. This might have been the first movie that Michael Gambon was into. I'm not sure, because again, as I mentioned in the earlier videos, haven't seen any of these movies with the exception of the first one. But like all the other ones, this movie was a big hit. The reviews were good on it. Enough said. I've heard nothing but good things. Probably will never watch it. And then we've got Spider-Man II, directed by Sam Raimi, starring Tobey Maguire, Kirsten Dunst, and Alfred Molina is Doc Ock. Awesome, awesome movie. Out of the 3 original Spider-Man films from Sam Raimi, this one is definitely the best. And not only that, this is one of the best superhero movies, period. At the end of all this stuff, I'm going to rank my superhero films, or at least my top 10. Spider-Man 2 will definitely be in that category. Great movie. Okay, now we're definitely switching into the action, and we're going with Troy, directed by Wolfgang Peterson, with an all-star cast featuring Brad Pitt, Orlando Bloom, Eric Bana, Diane Kruger, Sean Bean, Brian Cox, Brendan Gleeson, but especially Peter O'Toole. Peter O'Toole doesn't have a huge part in this movie. He's the best thing about this movie. I like Troy. I don't love it. Again, this is one of the movies we're going to talk about in that future video. Then we have National Treasure, starring Nicolas Cage. And who else is in this damn movie? Jon Voight, that's right. And directed by John Turteltaub. I'm sorry, I had a total spaz on Jon Voight for a second. National Treasure was a big hit, and people love this movie. I've always been underwhelmed by it. To me, it's a Walmart version of Raiders of the Lost Ark. I love Nicolas Cage, don't get me wrong. But I was not engaged in this film as much as most. It's not a bad film. I don't hate it. I just don't love it. And then we've got Kill Bill, Volume 2. Written and directed by Quentin Tarantino. Starring Uma Thurman, Michael Parks, Daryl Hannah, Michael Madsen, and David Carradine as Bill. This was the concluding chapter of the Kill Bill saga, of course. A lot of people consider this movie boring. Compared to the first one, it is boring. However, As I said in that previous video, I do not consider these two movies. I consider this one long movie. And I don't care what anybody says about it being slow. Kill Bill 2 fills in all those story holes from the first one and makes the entire movie a much more enriching experience. That's why I always watch both of these films back to back. But like I said in that previous video, because we're talking about years on film, Kill Bill Volume 2 kicks ass. Then we have The Bourne Supremacy, the second chapter in the Bourne trilogy, starring Matt Damon, Joan Allen, Carl Urban, and Chris Cooper. Directed by Paul Greengrass. I love all three of the Bourne movies. All three of them kick ass. This one too. I've got nothing bad to say about any of the movies, with the exception of the last two, because again, like I said in the first video, the reason why the first one is my favorite is because it's more of a traditional action movie. This one, and especially Bourne Ultimatum, so much quick cutting, so much quick camera moves, it gets a little discombobulating after a while. But as it is, Bourne Supremacy, it's a great movie. Now we're starting to go into the sci-fi a little bit. We're going to start off with The Day After Tomorrow, directed by Roland Emmerich, starring Dennis Quaid, Jake Gyllenhaal, Ian Holm. I like this movie. I don't love it. I love the special effects. I love the gigantic disaster scenes. But like most Roland Emmerich movies, they look great. They're fun when you're watching them. But when it's all said and done and you stop to think about it for a minute, you realize how stupid these movies really are. When Dennis Quaid is telling his son to stay inside because nothing can survive, and then proceeds to walk halfway across the country to find his son, I'm sorry, that's where I called bullshit. Again, I like this movie. I don't love it. Then we've got I, Robot, directed by Alex Price, starring Will Smith, Bridget Moynahan, James Cromwell, and Alan Tudyk. Just like Day After Tomorrow, I have mixed feelings about this movie. I absolutely loved the first half of it. The setup of this movie is fantastic. It's the climax. It's just CGI mayhem, and quite honestly, I didn't really care about it. But again, it's a well-made movie, well-acted movie. It's just not my favorite. The next sci-fi film we have for my Chronicles of Riddick collection, the Riddick collection, the second installment, the Chronicles of Riddick. That's not a very good picture, sorry. Pitch Black was a science fiction horror movie. Chronicles of Riddick is a science fiction action movie which tries to become this grand Star Wars scope epic. It's fun. I like Riddick. I like both of these movies. I really like the third one too. This one doesn't hold a candle to Pitch Black. Because again, Pitch Black was a low budget, came out of nowhere, surprise hit. They took that and they ran with it on this. And unfortunately, they released it PG-13 and it fell short. The director's cut of this movie is much better. That's the one I would suggest. But without a doubt, the biggest... Oh, wait a minute, what am I talking about? That ain't... Sorry. I totally screwed up and almost made a major mistake. Next, we're going into horror now. For my Blade trilogy. Unfortunately, the third installment, Blade Trinity, directed by David Goyer, starring, here we go, Wesley Snipes, Jessica Biel, and Ryan Reynolds. I don't know why I mentioned Wesley Snipes first, because he's barely in this damn movie. The majority of screen time is with Jessica Biel and Ryan Reynolds, and I understand they're two, at this point in their careers, two extremely young, extremely good-looking people. I wanted to see a Blade movie. I didn't want to watch a movie with those two. And I like both of those two, especially Ryan Reynolds. I can't stand this movie. Then we have Saw, directed by James Wan, starring Cary Elwes and Lee Winnell. This was the little movie that could. A little tiny independent movie directed by two guys, or written and directed by two guys that nobody in Hollywood had ever heard of. And, oh, I forgot, Danny Glover's in this too. And this movie took everybody by storm. This movie is credited with launching the torture porn part of horror for the next couple of years. Saw's great. The original Saw is a fantastic, fantastic movie. Great setup, great climax. The rest of the series is hit and miss with me, but the original one is a great movie. Then, this is not a horror film, but it's horror-inspired. Shaun of the Dead. The first movie in the Cornetto trilogy. Directed by Edgar Wright. Starring Simon Pegg. Oh, God, my camera's screwing up again, guys. I don't know what's going on here. Simon Pegg and Nick Frost. Shaun of the Dead again took everybody by storm. This is their love affair to George Romero, and you can tell. Not only is this movie funny, it's also scary. And these two guys, in addition to everyone else in the cast, give incredible performances. And I know Edgar Wright was big in the UK from TV work, and I don't know if he had a debut movie before this, but this was definitely my introduction to Edgar Wright, as well as these two. And my God, I love this film. I love all three of these films, but Shaun of the Dead, like I said, it came out of nowhere. Not only is it a hilarious movie, it's one of the best zombie movies ever. But I saved this one for last. Dawn of the Dead. Directed by Zack Snyder. Written by James Gunn. And starring Sarah Polley, Ving Rhames, Jake Weber, and Mekhi Phifer. As I said earlier, I was working in a theater when this came out. We got this teaser poster before we saw a trailer. And when I saw that there was a remake of one of my favorite, if not my favorite movies of all time, I was outraged. Because I hate remakes in general. But how dare they do a remake of my beloved Dawn of the Dead? Then we got the trailer for it. 30-second teaser. Saw it. Didn't really show much, but I was a little intrigued. Then this movie came out, and because I worked in the theater as the manager, the night before it actually physically came out, after hours, I held a private screening for any of my employees that wanted to watch, and I also called in a couple of my family members and friends to see if they wanted to come and see a free horror movie. But I told them, it's probably going to be a shitty remake. I was so wrong. This is the way that horror remakes should be done. It takes the general gist of the original story, that genesis of the idea of a zombie apocalypse and holding up in a mall, and it just expands on it in so many ways. This was definitely my introduction to both Zack Snyder and James Gunn, who have both gone on to incredibly successful careers on their own rights. It's also kind of ironic that years later, Zack Snyder, of course, would make his bones with the Batman and Superman films and was like the go-to guy for DC until they finally replaced him, and now James Gunn is in charge of the whole damn shebang. I love this movie. I cannot say enough about it. I generally don't like running zombie movies. This movie's the exception. It is fantastic in every way. And that's the end of 2004. I hope you guys enjoyed this. If you did, please, again, give me a thumbs up, a possible subscribe, and leave in those comments below how you feel about these films. And like I said, I am going to be dropping another video where I am going to expound on some of these movies and some of the experiences I had in the theater when these movies were released. So I hope you'll stay tuned for that one. If that one does not sound like a good idea to you, leave that in the comments as well and tell me just to keep plugging away like I have been. But until the next time, guys, I hope you enjoyed this. Have a great night.